I said, they're going to build a dome over the town. She's like, what? She says, you're crazy, go to sleep. I said, no. I said, back in the day, the University of Minnesota and a bunch of bigwigs put together this plan to have this utopia from 200 to 300,000 people, the whole 9 yards. I said, just the perfect sci-fi setting.
During the 1960s, some people living in America began to label the urban experience as a tragedy, with increased segregation and growing concerns about the state of the environment. In 1966, the Minnesota Experimental City was proposed to be a triumph over these urban tragedies. While the planning for the experimental city succeeded for a time, the project quickly lost support when the residents of one of the proposed construction sites protested, believing the project to be a tragedy that would change their way of life. While the project failed due to loss of public support, many ideas presented by the experimental city still live on. The urban renewal movement was a program in the 20th century that sought to solve urban problems caused by rapid population growth. However, instead of solving these problems, the Housing Act of 1949, which stated that blighted neighborhoods would be cleared and redeveloped, only intensified them. The Housing Act was amended in 1954 when the Federal Housing Agency stated that it would back loans for this redevelopment, and again in 1956, when new highways were built for ease of travel, but destroyed inner-city neighborhoods. With the start of the white flight, the mass exodus of Caucasians from the cities to the suburbs during the 1950s and 60s, the urban experience began to be labeled as a failure. During the 1960s, the idea of technology as a solution to the problems of the time was prevalent. This was because of the success of space missions, as well as the general optimism from positive change resulting from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The New Town movement was a movement that grew into prominence during the optimism of the 60s. These so-called new towns were utopian communities that were built from scratch and based on some ideal that would, in the minds of the futuristic planners, triumph over major problems with urban areas. Athelstan Spilhaus, the dean of the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology, was one of these futurists. In 1966, he published his idea of an experimental city in his comic series titled Our New Age. The comic series was widely distributed in newspapers throughout America and introduced scientific answers to problems such as traffic and pollution, proposing ideas that sound remarkably like the internet, electric cars, and other modern technologies. Spilhaus correctly identified many urban problems of the time, such as pollution and overpopulated city systems, and proposed that an experimental city be built in order to test technological solutions to these problems. If the solutions proved successful, they would be implemented throughout the nation in cities similar to the experimental city. Later in 1966, Athelstan Spilhaus joined a steering committee formed by Otto Silha, the vice president of the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, who was also pursuing the idea of a city of the future. The collaboration between the two allowed for the idea of the experimental city, or MXC, to develop.
It was Otto that I talked to about it because I daren't suggest anything like an experimental city. But Otto gave me encouragement. We went a little later to the president of the university. He gave us encouragement. We went on. We talked to the vice president. So when we went on to the experimental city, and I knew he was behind it, I was kind of real sure. And then I could go out and talk about this. But then from there on, we got more of our friends, our representatives from Minnesota behind the idea, private industries behind the idea. And then we had to bring it down to Washington The important thing was to get in the many groups in government that should be interested in this. It was worthwhile because we needed these three departments of government to participate in our effort.
The goal of the experimental city was to be a national lab in developing and evaluating new concepts and new programs needed to create an urban environment. Cars with internal combustion engines would be replaced by a guided rail system that would drive cars without the need for pollutants. Instead of a formal schooling system, centers for learning would be built throughout the city to create a lifelong learning system and eliminate the problem of overflowing schools. The planning and development of the city would be divided into phases of planning and construction. With Hubert Humphrey's loss to Richard Nixon in the presidential election of 1968, the experimental city lost federal support as the new administration believed the project to be unrealistic. In order to continue the project, Otto Silha turned to the Minnesota government, who established the Minnesota Experimental City Authority in 1971 with the purpose of locating a construction site for the city. A major problem with the planning of MXC was that the planners did not seek input from the public, with the plans for the city only being released when public opinion became a matter of importance. Because of the lack of public participation and the late release of plans, many different groups claimed the project to be in opposition of an urban lifestyle, and that it would destroy the environment of the site on which it would be built. In January of 1973, a march protesting the project was initiated in Swatara, a small town in central Minnesota that was one of the possible construction sites for the city.
I didn't want it. What I wanted for it. I wouldn't have moved out of here if it happened. If I wanted to live in a friggin' city, I'd moved to the city.
Soon after the Swatara protest, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency took a strong stance against MXC, expressing concerns that there was inadequate citizen participation in the planning, that impact studies done on the project were incomplete, and that construction of such a city did not seem prudent. One newspaper called the city social theory shoved down the throats of people who don't want it. Because of the large amount of public opposition to the project, the Minnesota government abandoned MXC, leaving the protesters triumphant, and the project defunded and forgotten. Today, many different experimental cities are being planned around the world. In Toronto, a technologically advanced neighborhood called Sidewalk Toronto is being planned with the help of the public. Like the Minnesota Experimental City, Sidewalk Toronto plans to implement technology into city planning in such a way that it enhances the experience of living in that city.
Sidewalk Labs is using technology as a way of enhancing human interaction, enhancing community, bringing us closer together, supporting the activities of our daily lives in ways that take away a lot of the barriers that separates us.
In South Korea, a high-tech city conceived in 2001 called Songdo has already been built. A major concept of the city was that it would implement means to limit pollution, an idea shared by the Minnesota Experimental City. Instead of a guided rail system, Songdo achieves this with a large number of walking paths and a variety of different forms of public transportation.
40% of the space is open space. You can leave your car at home and you can walk to Central Park. You can visit an office or a retail shopping center, all within walking distance.
While the technological aspects of the city are successful, a major problem with present-day Songdo is that there are too few people, though this is expected to be remedied long-term as more people move into the city. While the vision of the Minnesota Experimental City was never realized, many of its ideas have triumphed through time to be implemented today, where they have found a more welcoming reception.